Working as a luxury real estate agent, the woman froze upon realizing that the millionaire interested in the mansion was her late husband. She approached, and Emily Carter's heels echoed against the marble floor of the lavish Beverly Hills mansion as she prepared for her next showing. The property was a masterpiece. Glass walls framed the Los Angeles skyline, and an infinity pool sparkled under the California sun. For anyone else, walking through a house like this would be a dream. For Emily, it was just another day at work. She glanced at her reflection in the mirrored wall, adjusting the lapel of her tailored blazer. The polished image staring back at her gave no hint of the pain she carried beneath the surface. It had been 7 years since Michael, her husband, had died in a car accident, a wound that time hadn't fully healed. Emily had learned to push the grief aside, pouring herself into her career and building a reputation as one of the top luxury realtors in Los Angeles. Yet, even with her success, there were moments when the emptiness crept in, a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her assistant, Sophie, entered the room, clutching a tablet. "Emily, your 3 p.m. appointment is here, a Mr. David Anderson." Emily nodded, brushing off the sudden unease in her chest. It was probably just the stress of another high-stakes showing. "Thanks, Sophie. Let's make sure everything's ready," as she walked toward the grand entrance. Emily recited the property details in her mind, a coping mechanism she'd developed over the years. Facts were comforting. Facts didn't change. The doors swung open, and she plastered on her professional smile. "Mr. Anderson," she began, extending a hand, but her voice faltered the moment her eyes met his. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit that screamed money and influence. His dark hair was combed back neatly, and his piercing blue eyes held an air of confidence. But it wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he tilted his head, the slight smirk on his lips. Emily's heart pounded as her mind raced. It was Michael. "Are you all right?" the man asked, his tone smooth and polite, but his voice was unmistakably familiar. Emily blinked, forcing herself to regain composure. "Yes, of course. Welcome to the property," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. He introduced himself as David Anderson, a foreign businessman looking to invest in high-end real estate. Emily nodded along, her mind barely registering his words. She studied him closely. Every gesture, every inflection. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny. It was impossible to ignore. Her late husband had stood in front of her, alive and breathing, or at least someone who looked and sounded exactly like him. As she led him through the property, she caught snippets of his conversation, references to recent travels, business ventures, and casual remarks about the house. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a case of déjà vu or a striking look-alike. Deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. By the time they reached the outdoor terrace, Emily's professional mask began to crack. She turned to face him, determined to keep her emotions in check. "Do you have any specific requirements for your investment portfolio, Mr. Anderson?" David paused, glancing out at the city below. "I'm looking for something unique," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Emily's stomach churn. "A place that feels timeless." His words hung in the air, stirring memories Emily had buried long ago. Michael had always talked about finding a house that felt timeless, a sanctuary where they could grow old together. The coincidence was too much. As they finished the tour, David extended his hand to her once more. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I'll be in touch." Emily shook his hand, the contact sending a jolt through her. She watched him walk away, his confident stride eerily familiar, the moment the doors closed behind him. She let out a shaky breath, her heart racing. "Emily," Sophie's voice startled her. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily forced a smile. "I'm fine, Sophie. Just tired, that's all." But she wasn't fine, not even close. As she stood in the empty mansion, Emily knew one thing for certain. She had to find out who David Anderson really was, if he was Michael, if her husband had somehow survived the crash and disappeared. She needed answers. And if he wasn't, she didn't know how to explain the way her entire world had shifted in the span of an hour as she drove home that evening. Memories of Michael flooded her mind. The way he used to laugh, the way he held her after a long day, the plans they'd made for a future that had been ripped away too soon. She clenched the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts spiraling. Could it really be him? Or was she grasping at a ghost? Emily didn't know where this path would lead, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that her past wasn't as buried as she'd thought. Emily spent the night tossing and turning, her thoughts consumed by the man she'd met earlier. Every detail about David Anderson replayed in her mind. The way he moved, the subtle quirks in his smile, even his choice of words. It was as if Michael, her late husband, had stepped out of the past and reappeared in her present. But how could that be possible? By morning, her resolve was set. She had to know the truth, whether it was madness, coincidence, or something more sinister. Emily couldn't let it rest. She arrived at her office earlier than usual, her mind already racing with plans. Sophie greeted her at the door with a cup of coffee, her usual cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to Emily's tense energy. "Morning, Emily. You're here early," Sophie said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Emily replied curtly, taking the coffee and retreating to her desk. She wasn't ready to share her suspicions, not until she had something concrete. Opening her laptop, Emily began her search. She typed David Anderson into the browser, hoping to find information about the man who had so thoroughly disrupted her life. Hundreds of results appeared, but none seemed immediately relevant. He was a ghost, a man with no clear digital footprint, which struck her as odd for someone who claimed to be a successful businessman. She leaned back in frustration, her fingers drumming against the desk. "Think, Emily," she muttered to herself. If David was who he claimed to be, there had to be records, business deals, articles, something. And if he wasn't, her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Sophie peeked in, holding a folder. "I thought you might want this. It's the client file for Mr. Anderson. Standard stuff, but maybe it'll help." Emily took the folder with a murmured thanks, flipping through its contents. There wasn't much, just the basics he'd provided when scheduling the showing. A phone number, an email address, and an international business registration tied to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Her gut tightened. Who doesn't use a local agent for real estate, she thought. Most international buyers relied on intermediaries, but David had insisted on handling everything himself. It was yet another detail that didn't add up. Determined to dig deeper, Emily decided to call the number listed. Her hand trembled slightly as she dialed, the phone ringing twice before his smooth, familiar voice answered. "This is David Anderson." Emily froze for a moment, the sound of his voice sending a jolt through her. She forced herself to speak, keeping her tone light. "Mr. Anderson, this is Emily Carter. I just wanted to thank you again for your interest in the property yesterday. I was wondering if you had any additional questions or thoughts." Miss Carter," he said warmly. "The pleasure was mine. The property is certainly impressive, though I'll need some time to consider. I have a few other matters to attend to first." "Of course," Emily replied, masking her frustration. "If you'd like, I can send over more details or arrange another showing." "That won't be necessary for now," David said. There was a pause, and Emily could hear faint background noise, voices and music, as if he were at a party. "But I'll be in touch soon." The call ended abruptly, leaving Emily staring at the phone in her hand. Something about his tone unsettled her. He was too polished, too careful, like someone used to playing a role. Her next step was clear. She needed help. Picking up her phone again, she dialed James Porter, her old friend and trusted attorney. James had been by her side during the darkest days after Michael's death, helping her navigate the legal and financial mess left behind. If anyone could help her get to the bottom of this, it was him. "Emily," James answered after a few rings, his voice steady and familiar. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need a favor," Emily said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I met someone yesterday, and I need you to look into him. His name is David Anderson, but..." She hesitated, her voice faltering. "He looks exactly like Michael." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Emily," James said carefully, "are you sure about this?" "I'm not sure of anything," she admitted. "That's why I need your help." James sighed. "Send me whatever you have on him, I'll see what I can find." Relief washed over her as she ended the call. James had always been thorough, and she trusted him implicitly. If there was anything to uncover, he would find it. By the time she left the office that evening, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. The doubts and fears that had plagued her since meeting David were still there, but at least she was taking action. As she drove home, her mind raced with possibilities. What if she was wrong? What if David really was just a stranger with an uncanny resemblance to Michael? But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and Emily was determined to see it through, no matter where the truth might lead her. Emily sat on her living room couch, staring at the flickering glow of her laptop screen. It was well past midnight, and the silence of her apartment was deafening. A steaming cup of tea sat untouched on the coffee table as she scrolled through endless pages of search results, hoping for even the faintest lead on David Anderson. Her conversation with James earlier had left her restless, while she trusted him to dig deeper. Waiting wasn't something Emily did well. She needed to feel like she was making progress, no matter how small. Clicking on another link, she found herself looking at a glossy article about a recent charity gala in New York City. There, in the background of one of the photos, was a man who looked eerily like David, or Michael. Her breath caught, zooming in. She scrutinized the image. The resemblance was uncanny, though the man appeared slightly younger. Was this an older photo of Michael? Or was it David attending an event? The caption offered no help, only listing a few notable attendees. Frustrated but undeterred, Emily saved the image and made a mental note to show it to James later. As she leaned back against the cushions, memories of Michael flooded her mind. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift back to happier times. She could almost hear his laughter, see the way his face lit up when he talked about their future. They had been so in sync, or at least she'd thought so. Now, cracks in those memories began to surface. The nights he'd stayed late at work, the unexplained phone calls. Had she been blind to the signs all along? A sudden ping from her laptop snapped her out of her thoughts. It was an email from James. Subject: Preliminary Findings Body. Emily, I've done some digging. David Anderson is listed as the CEO of a foreign investment group, but most of the company's records are vague at best. No social media presence. No verifiable history before 5 years ago. I'm not saying it's suspicious, but it's unusual. Let's talk tomorrow. James. Unusual. Emily frowned at the word. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of her had hoped James would find something definitive, an answer that would either confirm or dismiss her fears. Instead, she was left with more questions. The next morning, Emily arrived at the office determined to keep herself busy. Work was her sanctuary, a place where logic and order reigned. But as the day wore on, her focus waned. Every client meeting, every phone call felt like an interruption to the nagging thoughts swirling in her mind. By early afternoon, James called. Emily, can you meet me at my office? I think we need to go over this in person. I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said, grabbing her purse. The drive across town was a blur, her nerves fraying with every passing minute. When she finally arrived, James greeted her with a tight-lipped smile, ushering her into his private office. I've been looking into David's financials, he began, sliding a folder across the desk. His company's structure is complicated. It's registered offshore, with multiple subsidiaries and holding accounts. It's not illegal, but it's the kind of setup you'd use to keep things hidden. Emily flipped through the documents, her heart sinking. What are you saying? I'm saying it's worth digging deeper, James replied. If this man really is Michael, he's gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Emily had held on to a shred of hope that this was all a misunderstanding, but now, the evidence was mounting against the man who had once been her everything. What do I do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That depends, James said carefully. Do you want answers, or do you want justice? Emily met his gaze, her jaw tightening. Both. James leaned back in his chair, nodding. Then we'll need more than what we have now. Bank statements, business records, anything that can tie him to his past. As she left James's office, Emily felt the weight of her decisions settle over her. She couldn't go back now. The truth was out there, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. That evening, Emily returned to the folder James had given her, poring over every detail. Among the paperwork was a list of recent transactions, one of which caught her eye. A payment to a luxury car dealership in Beverly Hills. The name on the invoice, David Anderson. Her pulse quickened as she grabbed her keys and headed out the door. The dealership wasn't far, and she knew she had to act quickly before second-guessing herself. When she arrived, the sleek showroom glistened under fluorescent lights, filled with cars that cost more than most people's homes. A young salesman greeted her warmly. "Welcome. Are you looking for something in particular?" Emily smiled politely. "Actually, I'm here about a recent sale. I'm considering a similar model and wanted to know more about the process." The salesman hesitated, but eventually obliged, pulling up a record on his computer. "We sold a high-end model to Mr. David Anderson just last month. Custom specifications fully paid up front." Emily's heart raced as she scanned the screen. It was him. She thanked the salesman and walked out, her mind spinning. David, or Michael, wasn't just alive. He was thriving, living a life of luxury built on secrets and lies. As she drove home, one thought echoed in her mind. If he had gone to such lengths to stay hidden, what else was he capable of? Emily knew she was only scratching the surface of a much darker truth. Emily woke up to an overcast sky, the dim light of the morning mirroring the heaviness in her chest. She hadn't slept much, her thoughts tangled in a web of memories and unanswered questions. The revelation at the dealership had confirmed one thing. David Anderson wasn't just some uncanny doppelganger of Michael. He was living the life they'd once dreamed of, but with none of the shared struggles that had built it. Her resolve hardened as she sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her. The next step was clear. Dig deeper into the man David Anderson had become. There were still too many gaps, and Emily needed more than circumstantial connections. Arriving at her office, she barely acknowledged Sophie's cheerful greeting. Her focus was razor-sharp as she opened her laptop and began sifting through public records and social media profiles. It was slow work. David seemed to have mastered the art of staying under the radar, but every small detail felt like a piece of a larger puzzle. By mid-morning, her phone buzzed. It was James. "I've got something for you," he said, his tone brisk. "David has a personal assistant. Her name is Lauren Hughes, and she's worked for him for about 3 years. If anyone knows his day-to-day, it's her." Emily's mind raced. "How do I get close to her?" "I might have a way," James replied. "She's attending a charity auction tomorrow night. I'll make sure your name is on the guest list." The following evening, Emily dressed carefully for the event. Her usual tailored suits were replaced by a sleek black gown, elegant but understated. She didn't want to draw attention, just enough to blend in with the crowd. As she arrived at the venue, the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses enveloped her. The auction was a spectacle of wealth, with attendees eager to flaunt their fortunes for a good cause, or more likely for appearances. Spotting Lauren wasn't difficult. She was seated near the front, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her posture exuding quiet confidence. Emily waited for the right moment, approaching her as the crowd shifted during a break between auctions. "Lauren Hughes?" Emily asked with a warm smile. "I believe we share a mutual acquaintance." Lauren glanced up, intrigued but cautious. "And you are?" "Emily Carter," she replied, extending a hand. "I work in real estate and David Anderson mentioned you. He spoke highly of your organizational skills." Lauren's expression softened, and she accepted the handshake. "Oh, Mr. Anderson. Yes, I handle his scheduling. It's nice to meet you." They exchanged pleasantries, and Emily carefully steered the conversation. Probing for information without raising suspicion, Lauren was polite but guarded, her answers revealing little about David's personal life. Still, Emily noticed subtle hints. A hesitation when she mentioned his travel plans, a nervous laugh when asked about his business dealings. As the evening wore on, Emily excused herself, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Lauren's behavior had confirmed her instincts. She knew something. Emily would have to find another way to get closer. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 days later, James called with another lead. "I pulled some strings and got access to David's business calendar," he said. "He has a private meeting scheduled at the Regency Hotel this Friday. Lauren will be with him." Emily's pulse quickened. "How did you... Actually, never mind. What's the plan?" "You'll have to improvise," James admitted. "But if you can position yourself in the right place at the right time, you might overhear something useful." Friday arrived with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Emily dressed in her most professional attire, blending seamlessly into the upscale environment of the Regency Hotel. She arrived early, scouting the lobby for any sign of David or Lauren. The minutes stretched painfully until, finally, she saw them. David's presence was commanding, his tailored suit impeccable as he moved through the room with an air of authority. Lauren trailed behind him, her expression focused as she clutched a leather portfolio. Emily kept her distance, observing from behind a marble column as they disappeared into a private meeting room. She needed a way in. Approaching the reception desk, Emily feigned confidence. "Hi, I'm here to deliver documents for Mr. Anderson's meeting," she said, holding up an empty folder she'd brought as a prop. "It's urgent." The receptionist hesitated, but eventually relented. "Of course. Please wait here, and I'll notify them." Emily's heart raced as she was led down the corridor. The door to the meeting room was slightly ajar, and she slowed her pace, pretending to check her phone as she positioned herself within earshot. Voices filtered through the gap. David's tone was firm but calm, discussing an upcoming business deal with an edge of urgency. Lauren chimed in occasionally, her words measured and careful. Then, something caught Emily's attention. "Make sure the Cayman accounts are secure," David said. "We can't afford any loose ends." Her breath hitched. The Cayman accounts James had mentioned. They were real, and David was actively protecting them. Emily stepped away before anyone noticed her, her mind spinning. The puzzle was coming together. David wasn't just hiding from his past. He was orchestrating something far more elaborate. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by a calculating stranger willing to do whatever it took to maintain his facade. As she exited the hotel, Emily's determination solidified. She wasn't just chasing answers anymore. She was chasing justice. Emily sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, but the enormity of what she was uncovering left her reeling. David, or Michael, was deeply entrenched in a network of deceit, and his Cayman accounts were the key to unraveling it all. The conversation she had overheard at the Regency Hotel confirmed that he wasn't just living a lie. He was orchestrating it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was James. "Emily," he began without preamble, "I've got another lead. There's a financial consultant named Mark Dawson who's tied to David's offshore accounts. He's based here in LA. If we can get him to talk, we might have a way to expose everything." Emily exhaled sharply. "How do we approach him?" "Carefully," James warned. "Mark is known for his discretion. He won't crack easily. But if you can get close to him, you might be able to learn something useful." Emily nodded, even though James couldn't see her. "Send me his details, I'll figure it out." As soon as she hung up, Emily felt a wave of resolve wash over her. This was no longer about confronting her past. It was about ensuring that Michael, or David, faced the consequences of his actions. That evening, Emily found herself at a high-end bar downtown, the kind of place where deals were sealed over expensive whiskey and quiet conversations. According to James, Mark Dawson was a regular here, and Emily was determined to make her move. She spotted him easily. A man in his late 40s. Dressed in a tailored suit, sipping a drink at the far end of the bar, his confident posture and air of self-assurance matched the profile James had given her. Emily adjusted her jacket and approached, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Excuse me," she said with a polite smile, sliding into the seat next to him. "You're Mark Dawson, aren't you?" He glanced at her, his expression cautious but curious. "Who's asking?" "Emily Carter," she replied, extending her hand. "I'm in real estate, and I've heard a lot about your work. Thought I'd introduce myself." Mark hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand. "Real estate, huh? Not exactly my field, but I appreciate the compliment." Emily ordered a drink, keeping the conversation light at first. She was careful to build rapport, dropping subtle hints about her connections to high-profile clients and offshore investments. Mark's interest peaked as she spoke, and before long, he was sharing anecdotes about his own experiences. "You'd be surprised how many people think they can outsmart the system," Mark said with a chuckle. "But there's always a trail, no matter how careful they are." Emily leaned in slightly, feigning intrigue. "And what about your clients? Do they ever get too confident?" Mark smirked, swirling his drink. "Oh, some do, but the smart ones know when to lay low." She took a sip of her cocktail, her mind racing. I imagine someone like David Anderson fits that category. Mark's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. David Anderson? Can't say I know the name. Emily tilted her head, pretending to be confused. That's odd. I could have sworn I saw you with him at the Regency Hotel last week. The tension in Mark's shoulders was almost imperceptible, but Emily caught it. She pressed on, her tone casual. Must have been someone else. My mistake. Mark downed the rest of his drink, signaling for the check. Well, Mrs. Carter, it's been a pleasure, but I should be going. Of course, Emily said, masking her disappointment. Maybe we'll cross paths again. As Mark left, Emily felt a flicker of frustration. She hadn't gotten the answers she needed, but she had rattled him, and that was a start. Mark was hiding something, and she wasn't about to let it go. The next morning, Emily met James at a cafe, updating him on her interaction with Mark. He's definitely connected to David, she said, stirring her coffee. But he's not going to open up easily. James nodded thoughtfully. Then we'll need to apply some pressure. If Mark feels cornered, he might slip up. Emily frowned. How do we do that? Leave that part to me, James said with a reassuring smile. In the meantime, you focus on keeping David close. He's bound to make a mistake. Emily's stomach twisted at the thought. Every interaction with David felt like walking a tightrope, balancing her growing anger with the need to maintain her facade. But James was right. David's arrogance would be his downfall, and Emily intended to be there when it happened. That afternoon, Emily received an unexpected call from David. Ms. Carter, he said smoothly, I've been thinking about the property we toured. I'd like to schedule a second viewing. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Of course, she replied, keeping her voice steady. When would you like to meet? Tomorrow morning, David said. I'll bring a few associates with me, Emily agreed, ending the call with a mix of dread and determination. This was her chance to get closer to him, to observe him in action, but it also meant facing the man who had turned her life upside down. As she prepared for the meeting, Emily reminded herself of why she was doing this. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about justice, and she wouldn't stop until the truth was fully exposed. The next morning, Emily stood in the grand entryway of the Beverly Hills mansion, her professional demeanor firmly in place. The property was staged to perfection, every detail meticulously crafted to impress even the most discerning buyers. But as she waited for David to arrive, her mind churned with the weight of her mission. She'd spent the night going over her plan. Today wasn't just about showing a house. It was about observing David, learning his patterns, and gathering anything she could use to expose him. Emily tightened her grip on the portfolio in her hands. Steeling herself for the encounter, the sound of a sleek car pulling up the driveway snapped her out of her thoughts. A black luxury sedan came to a stop, and David stepped out, flanked by two associates. They were impeccably dressed, their sharp suits and confident strides exuding an air of authority. David led the way, his presence commanding as always. Ms. Carter, he greeted her with a smile that made Emily's stomach churn. Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice. Of course, Mr. Anderson, Emily replied smoothly, forcing a polite smile. Shall we begin? As they moved through the house. Emily noted how David interacted with his associates. He spoke with measured confidence, pointing out features of the property as if he already owned it. It was a subtle display of power, a reminder that he was in control. But Emily also saw glimpses of the man she used to know, gestures and expressions that tugged at her memories, even as she reminded herself of his betrayal. When they reached the living room, one of David's associates asked about the security system. Emily launched into a detailed explanation, using the opportunity to study their reactions. The associate, a man named Victor, asked pointed questions about privacy and surveillance, questions that seemed oddly specific for a real estate transaction. Emily's curiosity grew as the tour continued. David's associates barely glanced at the luxurious finishes or sweeping views. Instead, they focused on logistical details, entrance points, layouts, and hidden features. It was as if they were assessing the house for something beyond its market value. By the time the tour ended, Emily's suspicions had deepened. David thanked her for her time, promising to follow up soon. As he shook her hand, his gaze lingered just a moment too long. You've been very helpful, he said, his tone laced with something Emily couldn't quite place. "I'll be in touch." She watched him leave, her heart pounding. There was more to David's interest in the property than he was letting on, and Emily was determined to find out what. Later that evening, Emily met James at his office to share what she'd observed. They weren't looking at the house like buyers, she said, pacing the room. They were studying it. Almost like, I don't know, like they were planning something. James frowned, leaning back in his chair. Planning what? "I don't know," Emily admitted. But Victor, one of his associates, asked a lot of questions about the security system. It felt off. James tapped a pen against his desk, his expression thoughtful. If they're using the property for something other than living, that could be another piece of the puzzle. "Did you get any names?" "Victor, no last name," Emily said. The other guy barely spoke. James scribbled the name down. "I'll see what I can find. In the meantime, keep playing along. The more you interact with David, the more likely he is to slip up." Emily nodded, though the thought of spending more time with David made her stomach churn. Still, she knew James was right. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about making sure David couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt her. The following day, Emily received a call from Lauren Hughes, David's assistant. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Anderson asked me to arrange another meeting," Lauren said, her tone professional but curt. "He's interested in finalizing some details regarding the property." Emily's pulse quickened. "Of course. When would he like to meet?" "Tomorrow afternoon," Lauren replied. "He'd prefer to meet privately, if that's possible," Emily agreed, ending the call with a mixture of anticipation and dread. A private meeting with David was both an opportunity and a risk. She spent the rest of the day preparing, reviewing every detail of the property and rehearsing her responses. If David was planning something, she needed to be ready. The next afternoon, David arrived alone. His demeanor was calm, almost casual, as if he had nothing to hide. But Emily wasn't fooled. Every move he made, every word he spoke, felt calculated as they walked through the house again. David paused in the dining room, his gaze drifting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This property has potential," he said, his tone contemplative. "It's secure, private, exactly what I'm looking for." Emily forced herself to remain neutral. "I'm glad to hear that. If you'd like, I can put together a formal offer." David turned to her, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "I'll need a few more details first. Tell me, what would you say is this property's greatest asset?" Emily hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Well, the privacy is certainly a major selling point," she said carefully. "It's also equipped with state-of-the-art security features, which I imagine would be important to someone in your position." David's lips curved into a faint smile. Indeed, the moment passed, and David shifted the conversation back to logistics. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that his interest in the property had little to do with its luxury. As the meeting ended, she watched him leave, her mind racing with questions. David was hiding something big, and Emily was determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. Emily spent the evening replaying her meeting with David, dissecting every word, every glance, his questions, his interest in the property's security. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple real estate purchase. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became to uncover his true motives. The next morning, Emily reached out to James, filling him in on the latest developments. "He's hiding something, James," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "This isn't about buying a house, it's something bigger." "I've been thinking the same," James replied. "I did some digging on his associate, Victor. Turns out he's tied to a private security firm with some questionable clients. They specialize in securing assets, and not the legal kind." Emily's stomach sank. "So they're using the house for something illegal?" "Possibly," James said, "but we need more than speculation. I've contacted a friend in cybersecurity to help us track down those Cayman accounts. If we can link David to something incriminating, it'll give us leverage." Emily nodded, though her anxiety was mounting. Every new piece of information seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. But she knew one thing for certain. David was far from the man she once thought she knew. That afternoon, Emily found herself back at her office, staring at the framed photo on her desk. It was an old picture of her and Michael, taken during a trip to Napa Valley. They'd been so happy then, their future stretching out before them like an open road. Now that road felt like a cruel illusion, a path she'd been forced to walk alone. Her thoughts were interrupted by Sophie, who poked her head into the room. "Emily, there's someone here to see you." Emily frowned. "Who is it?" She said her name is Rachel Cooper. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Rachel Cooper, the woman Michael had left her for, the woman who had helped him forge his new life. Emily hadn't seen her in years, but the mention of her name still sent a wave of anger and betrayal coursing through her. "Send her in," Emily said, her voice cold. Rachel entered the office with a confident stride, her designer heels clicking against the floor. She looked polished and composed, her smile as sharp as a blade. Emily forced herself to remain calm, though her hands clenched beneath the desk. "Emily," Rachel said, her tone saccharine. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," Emily replied coolly. "What do you want?" Rachel's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I thought we should talk. I have a feeling we're both involved in something bigger than either of us anticipated." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And what exactly do you think we're involved in?" Rachel hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "David's plans," she said finally. "I'm not sure what he's up to, but it's dangerous. More dangerous than you realize." Emily's heart raced, though she kept her expression neutral. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want to go down with him," Rachel admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "David doesn't trust me anymore. He's been shutting me out, keeping secrets. If you're digging into his life, you're probably closer to the truth than I am." Emily studied Rachel, searching for signs of manipulation. Could she trust her? Or was this just another ploy to protect herself? "If you want my help, you'll have to give me something concrete," Emily said firmly. "What do you know about his accounts in the Caymans?" Rachel's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "I know they exist. He's been funneling money through shell companies for years. He used the same methods when we were together. But if you want proof, you'll need access to his personal files. That's where he keeps everything." "And where are these files?" Emily pressed. Rachel hesitated, then sighed. "He has a private safe in his office. I don't know the combination, but I know it's biometric. You'll need his fingerprint to open it." Emily's mind raced. This was the break she needed, but it came with risks. If she got caught, David would know she was onto him. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Rachel met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because I'm tired of living in his shadow, and because I know you'll do what it takes to bring him down." That evening, Emily met James to discuss her conversation with Rachel. He listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with every detail. "This changes things," he said finally. "If we can get into that safe, we might find everything we need to expose him. But it's risky, Emily." "I know," she said, "but I'm willing to take that risk." James nodded, though his concern was evident. "We'll need a plan. If Rachel's telling the truth, we can't afford to make any mistakes." Emily agreed, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. For years, she'd buried her anger and pain, convincing herself that moving on was the only way to heal. But now, she had the chance to confront the man who had destroyed her life, and she wasn't about to back down. As she left James's office, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was dangerous, but she was ready to face it. She'd spent too long letting Michael's betrayal define her. It was time to take control of her story. Emily sat in her car outside David's office building, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she mentally rehearsed her next move. The information Rachel had given her was a game changer, but it also raised the stakes. Breaking into David's private safe wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about justice, and maybe even survival. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped out of the car and adjusted her blazer. She had scheduled a meeting with David under the pretense of discussing another luxury property. It was her way in, but she had no illusions about the risk, if he caught even a hint of her true intentions. It could all come crashing down. Inside the sleek, modern office, Emily was greeted by Lauren Hughes, David's assistant. Lauren offered a polite but detached smile, her demeanor as controlled as ever. "Mr. Anderson is expecting you," Lauren said, gesturing toward the private elevator. I'll let him know you've arrived. Emily nodded. Stepping into the elevator as the doors closed, she took another steadying breath, forcing herself to focus. She needed to stay calm, alert, and ready for anything. When she entered David's office, he greeted her with his usual charm. "Mrs. Carter," he said, rising from his chair. "Always a pleasure." "Likewise," Emily replied. Forcing a smile, her eyes quickly scanned the room, noting the sleek furniture, the expansive view of the city, and the faint hum of a high-tech security system. Somewhere in this space was the safe Rachel had described, and Emily needed to find it. They discussed the property for several minutes, David's questions precise but unremarkable. Emily played along, carefully steering the conversation to buy herself time. She noticed him glance at his watch, a subtle sign that his attention was waning. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" David said, rising from his seat. "I need to take a quick call." "Of course," Emily replied, her heart pounding as he left the room. This was her chance. The moment the door closed behind him, Emily sprang into action. She moved quickly but carefully, scanning the walls and cabinets for any sign of the safe. Her pulse raced as she opened a discreet panel behind a bookshelf, revealing the biometric lock Rachel had described. She crouched in front of it, her mind racing. Without David's fingerprint, the safe was impenetrable, but Rachel's tip had given her an idea. Earlier in the meeting, she'd noticed David sipping from a crystal glass. If she could retrieve his fingerprints from the glass, she might be able to trick the scanner. Emily grabbed a tissue from her bag and wiped the glass's rim, careful to preserve the print. Then, using a clear adhesive film she'd prepared earlier, she lifted the print and pressed it against the scanner. Her breath caught as the light blinked green, and the safe clicked open. Inside, Emily found folders of documents, a laptop, and several USB drives. She quickly scanned the contents, her eyes widening as she realized the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. Bank statements tied to offshore accounts, contracts for shell companies, and detailed logs of financial transactions. Everything Rachel had described and more. Emily took out her phone and began snapping pictures of the documents. She worked quickly, knowing she had only minutes before David returned. As she tucked the files back into the safe, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from James. "Be careful. Dawson's been asking questions. I think David suspects something." Emily's stomach tightened. She locked the safe and returned to her seat, slipping her phone into her bag just as the office door opened. "Apologies for the interruption," David said, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He glanced at her as if assessing her every move. "Where were we?" Emily forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "We were discussing the property's privacy features." David nodded, resuming his seat. Yes, privacy is critical, don't you think? In business and other areas." There was something chilling in the way he said it, as if he were testing her. Emily maintained her composure, steering the conversation back to safer topics. When the meeting finally ended, she left the office with a polite goodbye, her nerves frayed but her resolve intact. Back at her apartment, Emily spread the photos across her dining table, her hands trembling as she examined each one. The evidence was damning. Proof of David's illegal activities and the web of lies he'd spun to maintain his facade. But with this discovery came a new realization. Exposing him wouldn't just ruin his life, it would also put her in danger. Her phone buzzed again, and she saw another message from James. "We need to talk. Call me ASAP." Emily dialed his number, her voice taut with urgency. "I got into the safe," she said as soon as he answered. "I have the proof," James exhaled sharply. "That's great, but we have a problem. Mark Dawson's been digging into you. He's connected the dots between you and me, and if he tells David, then it's over." Emily finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" "First you need to lie low," James said. "Don't contact David or anyone else tied to him. Let me handle Dawson." Emily nodded, though fear was creeping into her chest. She'd come too far to back down now, but the risk was growing with every step. "Be careful, Emily," James added. "David isn't just dangerous. He's calculating. If he senses you're onto him, he won't hesitate to protect himself." As the call ended, Emily sat back, her mind racing. She had the evidence she needed, but the stakes had never been higher. If she made one wrong move, everything could unravel. And this time, she wouldn't just lose her dignity. She might lose everything. Emily barely slept that night, her mind a whirlwind of anxiety and determination. The photos she'd taken of David's files were clear and damning. They connected him to shell companies, offshore accounts, and questionable business dealings. It was the leverage she needed. But James's warning echoed in her mind. David wouldn't hesitate to protect himself, and if he suspected her involvement, she wouldn't be safe. The next morning, Emily met James in his office. He had a grave expression as he gestured for her to take a seat. "Dawson knows," James began without preamble. "He's already made contact with David." Emily's stomach dropped. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we're out of time," James said, leaning forward. "We need to move before David figures out what we're planning. I've compiled the evidence you gathered along with some additional financial records I dug up. It's enough to go to the authorities." Emily's mind raced. "And what happens after that? He's not just going to roll over." "No, he won't," James admitted. "But once the authorities are involved, his options will be limited. He can't go after you without incriminating himself further." Emily nodded, though a knot of fear settled in her chest. The thought of David finding out what she'd done was almost too much to bear. Still, she knew there was no turning back. Later that day, Emily received an unexpected call from David's assistant, Lauren. "Ms. Carter," Lauren began, her tone clipped. "Mr. Anderson has requested a meeting with you. He'd like to discuss the property and finalize some details." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "When?" "Tonight," he said. It was urgent. Emily hesitated. The timing felt deliberate, almost like a trap, but declining the meeting would only raise suspicion. "I'll be there," she said finally, her voice steady despite the dread creeping into her chest. That evening, Emily arrived at David's office, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she was led to the private conference room. The space was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. David stood by the window, his silhouette outlined by the city lights. "Mrs. Carter," he said without turning. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Emily replied, keeping her tone neutral. "You mentioned you wanted to finalize details about the property." David turned slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "I did, but first I wanted to ask you something." Emily's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "What is it?" David moved closer, his expression unreadable. "Do you believe in second chances?" The question caught her off guard. "I think everyone deserves a second chance," she said carefully, "but that depends on what they've done with their first." David's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Interesting answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily felt as though the walls were closing in around her, but she refused to let him see her fear. "Tell me," David continued, his tone deceptively casual. "Have you ever had someone betray you, Emily? Someone you trusted completely?" Her chest tightened, but she held his gaze. "I have," she said, her voice firm. "And I learned that betrayal doesn't erase the truth. It only delays it." David's smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. Wise words. He gestured for her to sit, and Emily complied, though her senses were on high alert. David poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to her before taking a seat across the table. "I admire your resilience," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "It's rare to find someone so composed under pressure." Emily's grip on the glass tightened. "Pressure is part of the job," David chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Indeed, and you've handled it remarkably well." The conversation shifted to the property, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that David was testing her. Every question, every comment seemed laced with subtext, as though he were searching for cracks in her facade. When the meeting finally ended, Emily felt a rush of relief as she stepped out into the cool night air. But her relief was short-lived. As she walked to her car, she noticed a figure lingering near the entrance to the parking garage. Her heart raced as she recognized him. It was Mark Dawson. "Ms. Carter," he called, his voice calm but unsettling. "A moment of your time." Emily froze, her mind racing. "What do you want?" "Just a friendly conversation," Dawson said, his tone dripping with insincerity. "You've been asking a lot of questions about Mr. Anderson." That's not exactly discreet, you know. Emily squared her shoulders, masking her fear with defiance. I'm a real estate agent. It's my job to ask questions. Dawson smirked. Sure it is. But let me give you some advice. Stop digging. You won't like what you find. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. And if you keep pushing, it might not end well for you. Emily's breath hitched, but she refused to back down. Is that a threat? Just a warning, Dawson replied, his smirk widening. Have a good night, Miss Carter. He turned and walked away, leaving Emily shaken but resolute. She climbed into her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she tried to steady her breathing. This wasn't just about David anymore. The danger was real, and it was closing in. But Emily knew she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to exposing the truth. Emily sat in her apartment, her thoughts racing after her encounter with Mark Dawson. His words lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. Stop digging. You won't like what you find. It was a warning, but also a confirmation. She was getting too close to the truth, and David, or Michael, was feeling the heat. For a moment, fear threatened to paralyze her, but she quickly pushed it aside. She couldn't stop now, not when justice was within reach. The next morning, Emily met James at a quiet cafe. She relayed everything. David's cryptic behavior during their meeting, Dawson's warning in the parking garage, and her growing sense that the walls were closing in. James listened intently, his expression grave. Emily, this is escalating faster than I anticipated. Dawson's involvement means they know you're a threat. We need to act now. Emily nodded. Do we have enough to go to the authorities? Almost, James said. The evidence you got from David's safe is strong, but we need to connect the dots. If we can prove those offshore accounts are linked to illegal activities, it's game over. And how do we do that? Emily asked, her voice tinged with frustration. James hesitated before responding. We need access to his primary bank account. If we can tie transactions from those accounts to his shell companies, it'll seal the case. Emily's heart sank. And how am I supposed to get access to that? James leaned forward, his voice low. I have a contact who can help, but it'll require taking a bigger risk. Are you ready for that? Emily took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. I don't have a choice, do I? That afternoon, Emily returned to her office, her mind preoccupied with James's words. The stakes were higher than ever, but she couldn't back down now. As she sifted through paperwork, her assistant Sophie entered with a hesitant expression. Emily, there's a delivery for you, Sophie said, holding out a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Emily frowned, taking the package. There was no return address, only her name written in block letters. She opened it cautiously, her pulse quickening as she pulled out a USB drive and a note. The note was typed, its message chillingly brief. For your eyes only. Trust no one. Emily stared at the USB drive in her hand, a mix of curiosity and dread coursing through her. She plugged it into her laptop, her fingers trembling as she opened the single file it contained. Her screen filled with spreadsheets, transaction logs, and correspondence. Documents that painted a damning picture of David's operations. The evidence was overwhelming. Payments from shell companies to known criminal organizations. Offshore transfers tied to money laundering schemes. And detailed communications outlining fraudulent real estate deals. It was everything she needed to take David down. But the question loomed. Who had sent it? Emily called James immediately, her voice trembling as she explained what she'd received. This is it, James said, his excitement tempered by caution. This ties everything together, but Emily, you need to be careful. Whoever sent this is either an ally or someone trying to set you up. I know, Emily replied. But we can't ignore it, James agreed. And they made plans to review the files together that evening. But as Emily hung up the phone, a wave of unease washed over her. The note's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one. That evening, Emily drove to James's office, the USB drive tucked securely in her bag. The streets were quiet, the city bathed in the glow of streetlights. She parked her car and entered the building, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As she approached James's office, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down her spine as she pushed it open. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of a desk lamp. Papers were scattered across the desk, and James was nowhere to be seen. Emily's heart raced as she stepped inside, her gaze darting around the room. "James!" she called out, her voice shaking. No response. Her eyes landed on the desk, where a single piece of paper had been left. It was a handwritten note in James's familiar scrawl. "Emily, get out, they're watching." Before she could process the message, a noise behind her made her spin around. The door closed with a soft click, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Mark Dawson. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone calm but menacing. "You've been busy." Emily's heart pounded as she backed away. "Where's James?" Dawson smirked. "Let's just say he's indisposed, but don't worry, he's alive for now." "What do you want?" Emily demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "What I want," Dawson said, stepping closer, "is for you to stop playing detective. Hand over the drive, and this ends here." Emily clenched her fists, her mind racing. If she gave Dawson the USB, everything she'd worked for would be lost. But if she refused, there was no telling what he might do. "Think carefully, Mrs. Carter," Dawson said, his voice a low threat. "This isn't a game you can win." Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You're right. It's not a game. It's my life." Before Dawson could react, Emily grabbed the desk lamp and swung it at him, the shattering sound filling the room. He stumbled back, cursing, as Emily bolted for the door. She ran down the hallway, her heart pounding as she clutched the USB drive. She didn't stop until she was safely in her car, her hands shaking as she locked the doors. As she sped away, Emily's mind raced. James was in danger, and David's network was closing in on her. But she still had the USB, and with it, the power to expose the truth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Emily didn't stop driving until she reached the outskirts of the city. Her heart was pounding, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as the reality of the situation set in. Mark Dawson's warning, James's disappearance, and the ambush at the office. It was all too much. But despite the fear gnawing at her, Emily knew she couldn't back down. Not now. She pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Inside the dimly lit room, she sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the USB drive. The weight of what it represented felt overwhelming. With it, she could destroy David's empire. But at what cost? Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was an unknown number. For a moment, she debated letting it ring, but curiosity got the better of her. "Emily Carter," she answered, her voice tight. "Ms. Carter," a familiar voice replied. It was David. "I'm glad you picked up." Her blood ran cold. "David," she said, masking her shock. "What do you want?" He chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down her spine. "You've been busy, haven't you? Digging where you shouldn't. Asking questions you don't want the answers to." Emily's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," he said, his tone laced with menace. "You've become quite the investigator. But here's the thing about digging, Emily. It has a way of burying people." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," David replied smoothly. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop whatever it is you think you're doing, and you're going to hand over what you've taken. Otherwise, people will get hurt, people you care about." Emily's stomach churned as she thought of James. "Where is he?" David's tone darkened. "Alive for now, but that depends on you. Consider this your only warning, Emily." The line went dead, leaving her in stunned silence. Her fear quickly morphed into anger. David's arrogance, his belief that he could control her, only fueled her resolve. She wouldn't let him intimidate her. Not anymore. The next morning, Emily called James's office repeatedly, hoping for some sign of him. Each time, the calls went unanswered. Desperate, she decided to visit his apartment. If Dawson and David had him, she needed to know for sure. When she arrived, the building's doorman recognized her immediately. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "Mr. Porter hasn't been home in 2 days. Is everything all right?" Emily forced a reassuring smile. "I'm sure it is. He's probably just busy with work." The doorman nodded, but his worried expression lingered. Emily's facade cracked as she stepped into the elevator, her chest tightening with worry. When she reached James's apartment, she found the door locked, and no response to her knocks. She stood in the hallway, her mind racing. If James was gone, then she was truly on her own. But she still had the USB, and she still had options. The question was how to proceed without risking anyone else's safety. That evening, Emily decided to meet Rachel again. She didn't trust her entirely, but Rachel was the only other person who understood what David was capable of. They met at a quiet cafe, Rachel arriving fashionably late. As always, she slid into the seat across from Emily, her sharp eyes scanning the room before focusing on her. "You look terrible," Rachel said bluntly. "Thanks," Emily replied dryly. "I'm dealing with your ex, so that tracks." Rachel smirked. But the humor quickly faded. "What's going on?" "David knows," Emily said, leaning forward. "He called me last night. He has James." Rachel's expression darkened. "And he threatened you, I assume?" Emily nodded. "He wants the USB, but I can't give it to him. Not after everything he's done." Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. "David doesn't make empty threats, Emily. If he feels cornered, he'll do whatever it takes to protect himself. That's why I need your help," Emily said. "You know him better than anyone. What's his next move?" Rachel hesitated, her gaze distant. "He'll escalate if he thinks you're a threat. He'll try to eliminate you." Emily swallowed hard, the weight of Rachel's words sinking in. "Then we have to act first." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Emily hesitated before pulling the USB drive from her bag. "This is everything. Proof of his crimes, his offshore accounts, everything. If we can get this to the authorities, we can take him down." Rachel stared at the drive, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "That's a dangerous gamble." "It's the only one we have," Emily said firmly. "Are you in or not?" Rachel exhaled slowly, then nodded. "I'm in. But if we're doing this, we need a plan." The two women spent hours strategizing, mapping out every possible move and contingency. Rachel agreed to leverage her past connections to distract David while Emily prepared to deliver the evidence to the authorities. It was a dangerous plan, but it was their best shot. As they parted ways, Rachel placed a hand on Emily's arm. "Be careful," she said. "David's more dangerous than you realize." Emily nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I know, but so am I." As she drove home that night, Emily felt a mix of fear and determination. The net was tightening, and the final confrontation with David was inevitable. But she was ready. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a chance to reclaim her life and make things right. This wasn't just about exposing David's lies anymore. It was about proving to herself that she was stronger than he ever gave her credit for. Emily woke early the next morning, the weight of her decisions pressing heavily on her chest. Today was the day she and Rachel would put their plan into motion. The USB drive was secure in her bag, a small object carrying the power to dismantle David's empire. But it also carried risks that could cost her everything. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman who looked back. This version of Emily wasn't the one who quietly accepted betrayal and loss. This Emily was sharper, bolder, and prepared to fight for the truth. Later that morning, Emily met Rachel at a discreet location, a parking garage far from prying eyes. Rachel arrived in her sleek black car, stepping out with her usual air of confidence, but beneath her polished exterior, Emily could sense her unease. "Ready?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. "As ready as I'll ever be," Emily replied. Rachel handed her a burner phone. "This is your lifeline if something goes wrong." "Call me," Emily nodded, slipping the phone into her pocket. "What about you? Are you sure you can handle your part?" Rachel smirked faintly. "David may think he's untouchable, but I know how to get under his skin. He won't see me coming." With their plan finalized, they parted ways. Rachel would distract David, keeping him occupied while Emily delivered the USB drive to James's contact, a trusted agent at the Department of Justice who had agreed to meet her in person. The agent had insisted on secrecy, emphasizing the importance of avoiding any digital trails. The meeting was set to take place at a cafe on the outskirts of the city. Emily arrived early, scanning the room for anything suspicious. The agent, a man in his late 40s with a calm demeanor, was already seated in a corner booth. He gave her a subtle nod as she approached. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly, gesturing for her to sit. "I understand you have something for me." Emily placed the USB drive on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "This contains everything. Financial records, communications, evidence of illegal transactions. It's all tied to David Anderson." The agent picked up the drive, examining it briefly before slipping it into his pocket. "We'll verify the contents and take it from here. If what you've provided checks out, it'll be enough to launch a full-scale investigation." Emily exhaled, a flicker of relief washing over her. "What happens now?" "We'll move quickly," the agent assured her. "But you need to be careful. If Anderson realizes what's happening before we're ready, he could retaliate." Emily nodded. Though her nerves were still raw, she left the cafe feeling both lighter and more vulnerable than ever. The evidence was out of her hands, but the danger was far from over. Meanwhile, Rachel carried out her part of the plan with precision. She showed up unannounced at David's office, feigning concern about rumors she'd heard regarding his business dealings. "You're being paranoid," David said, leaning back in his chair, but Rachel could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Am I?" she countered, her tone sharp. "People are talking, David. If you don't get ahead of this, it could ruin everything." David frowned, clearly torn between dismissing her and considering her words. Rachel pressed further, drawing on her knowledge of his weaknesses to keep him distracted. But even as she played her role, Rachel couldn't shake the sense that David was already one step ahead. His calm exterior felt too controlled, too practiced. She left the meeting with a sinking feeling, her confidence shaken. That evening, Emily returned to her apartment, hoping for a quiet moment to gather her thoughts. But as she unlocked the door, a chill ran down her spine. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. She stepped inside cautiously, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. Her living room was untouched. But when she entered the bedroom, her blood ran cold. Drawers had been pulled open, papers scattered across the floor. Someone had been here. Emily's phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. It was Rachel. "Emily, we have a problem," Rachel said, her voice tense. "David knows." Emily's breath hitched. "Knows what?" "Everything," Rachel replied. "He confronted me after I left his office. He's pieced it together. Your involvement, the USB, all of it." Emily's mind raced. "What do we do?" "We don't have time to panic," Rachel said. "You need to leave now. He won't stop until he finds you." As Rachel spoke, Emily heard a noise outside. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Her pulse quickened as she moved toward the door. Peeking through the peephole, a figure stood just outside, their shadow looming. "Rachel," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone's here." Rachel's tone hardened. "Get out. Take the fire escape if you have to, but don't stay there." Emily grabbed her bag, adrenaline surging as she slipped out the back door and onto the fire escape. The cold night air bit at her skin as she climbed down, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't stop moving until she reached her car, her hand shaking as she started the engine. As she sped away, her phone buzzed again. It was Rachel. "Where are you going?" Rachel asked. "I don't know," Emily admitted, her voice cracking. "But I can't stay in one place." "Good," Rachel said. "Keep moving. I'll call you when it's safe." Emily nodded, though Rachel couldn't see her. As she drove into the night, the gravity of her situation hit her in full force. David wasn't just dangerous, he was relentless. And now, he was coming for her. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Emily drove aimlessly through the darkened streets, her mind racing. Every shadow cast by the dim streetlights felt like a threat. Every pair of headlights in her rearview mirror sent her pulse racing. David knew the careful web of lies and plans she had built was unraveling faster than she could control. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was James. "Emily," his voice was faint but steady, a relief after the radio silence. "I'm okay. They roughed me up a little, but I'm fine." "Oh my God, James," Emily gasped, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm at a motel outside the city," he said. "But listen, Emily, you need to hear this. David isn't just after you. He's trying to destroy the evidence. I overheard Dawson talking about it. He has people working to track down that USB." Emily's stomach churned. "The DOJ agent has it. I handed it over this morning." James's silence was deafening. Then, in a low, urgent voice, he asked, "Are you sure you can trust them?" The question sent a cold shiver down her spine. She had no reason to doubt the agent, but the stakes were too high to take anyone's loyalty for granted. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it was our best shot." "Then we have to make sure the evidence doesn't disappear," James said. "There's a paper trail in David's financial network. If we can expose that too, it'll back up what's on the USB. Emily's mind raced. The safe. She had only scratched the surface of what she had seen in David's office. "I think I know where to find more," she said, "but I'll need help getting back in." "I'll do whatever it takes," James replied. "Just tell me where to meet you." The next morning, Emily and James met at a diner on the edge of town, their expressions grim but determined. James looked worse for wear, with a bruise on his cheek and a limp in his step, but his resolve was unshaken. "I still have access to David's schedule," Emily said, sliding her laptop across the table to show James a shared calendar. "He's hosting a private meeting tonight. If he's preoccupied, we might have a window to get into his office." James frowned, his brows knitting together. "That's a big risk, Emily. If we get caught." "We won't," she interrupted. "Rachel is helping. She'll keep him busy." James raised an eyebrow. "Rachel? The same woman who helped him ruin your life. She has her reasons," Emily said firmly. "And right now, she's our best chance." James didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Fine, but we need a backup plan in case something goes wrong," Emily agreed. They spent the next few hours mapping out their strategy, covering every possible scenario. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had. That evening, Emily arrived at David's building under the cover of twilight. James waited in the car, his eyes scanning the street for any signs of trouble. Emily's heart pounded as she slipped through the side entrance. Her steps light and deliberate. Rachel had come through on her promise. David was at a high-profile dinner across town, leaving his office temporarily unguarded, but Emily knew better than to assume she was safe. David's reach was vast, and his people were everywhere. She reached his office and quickly disabled the alarm using a code Rachel had provided. The door clicked open, and Emily stepped inside, her hands trembling slightly. The room was just as she remembered, sleek, minimalistic, and meticulously organized. But this time, she wasn't here to admire the decor. Emily went straight for the safe, her fingers flying over the biometric scanner. She used the same technique as before. Lifting a partial fingerprint from the desk with the clear adhesive she had prepared, the scanner blinked green, and the safe opened with a soft click. Inside, she found more than she expected. Stacks of documents, encrypted hard drives, and a ledger that made her breath catch in her throat. It was all there. Proof of David's fraudulent dealings, his connections to criminal networks, and the vast sums of money he had laundered through his shell companies. Emily quickly photographed everything, her movements precise but hurried. She couldn't afford to waste time. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "David just left the dinner. You don't have much time. Get out now." Emily's pulse quickened. She stuffed the documents back into the safe and closed it, wiping down every surface she'd touched. She was almost at the door when the sound of footsteps froze her in place. "Emily?" Her blood ran cold at the sound of David's voice. She turned slowly, forcing herself to meet his piercing gaze. He stood in the doorway, his expression calm but his eyes burning with barely restrained fury. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. Emily's mind raced, searching for an explanation. "You left some paperwork unfinished," she said, keeping her tone steady. "I thought I'd take care of it." David's smile didn't reach his eyes. "How thoughtful of you, but I don't remember giving you access to my safe." Emily's stomach dropped. He knew. The room seemed to shrink as David stepped closer, his presence suffocating. Emily forced herself to stand her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "You've been very busy, haven't you?" David said, his voice low and dangerous. "Digging into things that don't concern you. They concern me," Emily shot back, her voice shaking but defiant. "You destroyed my life, David. You betrayed me, and you think you can get away with it. But you're wrong." David's smile faltered, his expression hardening. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Emily. This isn't a game." "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "It's justice." Before David could respond, The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. James appeared in the doorway, his face pale but determined. "Let her go," James said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. David's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between them. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. "Both of you." Emily didn't wait to find out what he meant. She and James bolted down the hallway, the weight of David's glare burning into their backs. They didn't stop running until they were safely back in the car, the documents and photos securely in hand. As they drove into the night, Emily felt a surge of determination. The game wasn't over yet, but the end was finally in sight. The car was silent except for the hum of the engine as Emily and James drove through the empty streets. The tension between them was palpable. Both knowing how close they had come to disaster, Emily clutched the camera in her lap, the photographs of David's ledger and documents still fresh in her mind. This was their trump card, the final piece they needed to expose him. "We have to act fast," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but the strain was evident. "David won't let this slide. He'll come after us with everything he has." Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the camera. "We take this to the DOJ agent. Tonight, we can't risk waiting." James glanced at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "Are you sure you can trust him after everything? We can't afford another betrayal." "I don't have a choice," Emily said. "We've come too far to stop now." An hour later, they pulled into a parking lot outside a nondescript government building. The DOJ agent, Nathan Burke, was waiting for them near the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. "You're late," Burke said as they approached. His tone clipped. "Do you have it?" Emily handed him the camera without hesitation. "Everything's on there. Photos of the ledger, the documents in his safe, proof of the shell companies, offshore accounts, and money laundering." Burke reviewed the camera briefly, nodding as he scrolled through the images. "This is good. We can use this." James stepped forward, his expression wary. "What happens now?" "We move quickly," Burke replied. "This evidence is enough to justify a raid on Anderson's properties and freeze his accounts. Once he's cornered, he'll have no choice but to face the charges." Emily exhaled, a flicker of relief washing over her. "How long will it take?" Burke's lips tightened. "A few hours at most, but you two need to lay low. If Anderson realizes what's coming, he won't hesitate to retaliate." James nodded, pulling Emily aside. "We need to find somewhere safe to wait this out," Emily agreed, though the weight of the situation hung heavy in her chest. They had handed over everything, but it still felt like the danger was closing in. Back in the car, James drove them to a secluded motel on the edge of the city. The room was small and bare, but it was all they needed. Emily paced the floor while James sat at the small table, staring at his phone. "He's going to come after us," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Even if the DOJ takes him down, he won't stop." James looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. "That's why we have to trust that the system will do its job. We've done everything we can." Emily stopped pacing, her gaze distant. "I just keep thinking, how did it come to this? He was my husband, James. I loved him." James stood, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than he ever gave you credit for. He underestimated you, and that's why we're going to win." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She had come too far to let doubt creep in now. Hours passed in tense silence, the weight of anticipation pressing down on them. Then, James's phone buzzed. It was a text from Burke. "Operation underway. We'll update soon." Emily and James exchanged a look, the unspoken tension filling the room. All they could do now was wait. Meanwhile, at David's estate, chaos erupted. Federal agents swarmed the property, their vehicles blocking every entrance. David stood in his office, his calm facade cracking as he watched the commotion unfold on the security monitors. "Sir," one of his associates said, his voice panicked. "They've frozen the accounts. We can't access anything." David's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone, dialing a number with shaky hands. When the call connected, his voice was cold and sharp. "Find her now!" Back at the motel, Emily's phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding as she saw the caller ID, Rachel. "Emily!" Rachel's voice was frantic. "David knows where you are. He sent people after you." Emily's stomach dropped. How does he know? I don't know, Rachel admitted. But you need to get out of there now. Emily turned to James, her face pale. We've been compromised. We need to leave. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed their belongings and ushered her toward the car as they pulled out of the parking lot. Emily glanced back, her fear mounting with every passing second. Where do we go now? She asked, her voice trembling. Somewhere he can't find us, James replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. We just need to stay ahead of him until the DOJ finishes the job. Emily nodded, though the dread in her chest only grew. She knew David wouldn't give up easily, and the final confrontation felt inevitable. They drove for hours, taking back roads and avoiding major highways. Emily's mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. But as the sun began to rise, she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry at David for what he'd done, angry at herself for ever trusting him, and determined to see this through to the end. We'll finish this, she said quietly, more to herself than to James. One way or another. James glanced at her, his expression resolute. We will. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Emily knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The morning light filtered through the car windows as Emily and James pulled into a secluded rest stop miles outside the city. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but adrenaline kept them moving. Every moment felt like borrowed time. A fragile barrier between them and the storm they knew was closing in. Emily leaned against the hood of the car, her arms crossed as she scanned the quiet surroundings. Do you think it's over for him? She asked, her voice low. James shook his head. Not yet. Men like David don't just crumble under pressure. They fight. He's still dangerous. Emily nodded, the knot in her stomach tightening. She had seen firsthand how far David was willing to go to protect his empire, but she had also seen the cracks forming in his once impenetrable facade. He was cornered now, and a cornered man was unpredictable. Her phone buzzed. Pulling her from her thoughts, it was a text from Rachel. David's people are scattering. The DJ raid hit harder than he expected, but he's not finished. Be careful. Emily sighed, showing the message to James. Rachel says he's still a threat. James frowned, rubbing his temples. We need to stay ahead of him. The DOJ has enough evidence now to bring him down, but until they have him in custody, we're not safe. Emily hesitated, then asked, Do you think he'll come for us personally? James met her gaze, his expression grim. If he feels like he's out of options. Yes. By late afternoon, they had relocated to a remote safe house arranged by James's contacts. It was a small cabin tucked away in the woods, far from any prying eyes. Emily felt a brief flicker of relief as she stepped inside, but the tension in her chest refused to ease. James set up a temporary communication station, keeping tabs on the DOJ's progress. Meanwhile, Emily paced the room, her mind racing with possibilities. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside made her jump, her nerves fraying with each passing hour. As dusk fell, James received a call. He answered quickly, his voice sharp. Burke, what's the update? Emily watched him closely, her heart pounding as his expression darkened. He ended the call and turned to her, his jaw tight. They lost him, James said, his tone grim. David slipped through their net during the raid. He's in the wind. Emily's stomach dropped. What do we do now? We stay put, James said firmly. This place is off the grid. He won't find us here. But Emily wasn't convinced. David's reach had always been far and wide, and she knew better than to underestimate him. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The cabin was quiet, the kind of silence that amplified every small noise. She sat by the window, staring out at the dark woods, her mind replaying the events of the past weeks. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment of fear had led her here. But she refused to let David win. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of tires crunching gravel. Her heart skipped a beat as she strained to see through the darkness. A pair of headlights emerged in the distance, growing closer. James, she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. Someone's coming. James was on his feet instantly, his expression alert. He grabbed his phone and moved to the front door, peering outside. The car came to a stop a few yards away, and the engine cut off. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, The door opened and David stepped out. Emily's breath hitched as she saw him. He was dressed in his usual tailored suit, but his appearance was disheveled, his face lined with tension. He looked like a man on the edge, his once cool demeanor now replaced by a simmering fury. James locked the door, his voice low and firm. "Stay behind me." David approached the cabin slowly, his hands visible. When he reached the porch, he called out, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Emily, James, let's have a little chat, shall we?" Neither of them responded. Inside, Emily's mind raced. What was his play? He was unarmed, or at least appeared to be, but she knew better than to trust appearances. David knocked lightly on the door, his smile sharp. "Come on, Emily. We were married once, surely. You can spare a few minutes for old time's sake." Emily's stomach churned, anger and fear warring within her. She stepped forward, ignoring James's warning look. "What do you want, David?" she called through the door. David's expression darkened. "What I want is for you to stop. You've meddled in my life enough. Hand over the evidence. And this all ends tonight." Emily's voice hardened. "It's too late for that. The Doge already has everything. Your empire is crumbling, David." David laughed bitterly. "You think they'll stop me? You think any of this will stick?" His tone shifted, becoming cold and sharp. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Emily. I've built my life on knowing how to win." "Not this time," Emily shot back. "This time you lose." David's smile faded, replaced by a deadly seriousness. "You've made your choice. Then, let's see if you can live with it." Before she could respond, he turned and walked back to his car, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. The engine roared to life, and he sped off into the night, leaving Emily and James standing in the suffocating silence as the taillights disappeared. James exhaled sharply. "That wasn't a warning, Emily. That was a promise." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we need to be ready. He's not going down without a fight." The silence in the cabin was oppressive after David's departure. Emily and James exchanged a tense glance, both knowing the next move was critical. David's appearance wasn't a random act of intimidation. It was a calculated warning, and if they didn't act fast, he would make good on his promise. James broke the silence. "We need to assume he's already planning his next move. He's desperate, Emily, and desperate men are dangerous." Emily nodded, her jaw tightening. "We can't let him regain control. He's losing everything, and that's when he'll lash out the hardest." James pulled out his laptop, the faint glow illuminating his furrowed brow. "I'll contact Burke if David's on the move. They need to know. He's running out of options, but we can't underestimate him." Emily paced the cabin, her mind racing. The fear that had once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. For years, she had allowed David's betrayal to define her, to shape the walls of her world, but not anymore. This was her moment to take back control. As dawn broke, Burke called James back with an update. "We've traced Anderson's movements," Burke said, his voice steady but urgent. "He's holed up at one of his private properties, a small estate on the outskirts of the city. We're assembling a team to move in, but we'll need confirmation that he's there before we act." James relayed the information to Emily, who nodded. "If they need confirmation, I can give it to them." James frowned. "No way. It's too dangerous. Let the agents handle it. I'm the one who brought him to this point," Emily countered, her tone firm. "I'm not sitting on the sidelines now." James hesitated, but the determination in Emily's eyes silenced his protests. "Fine," he said reluctantly, "but we do this carefully. No risks." That afternoon, Emily and James drove toward David's estate, their car blending into the traffic on the highway. The tension between them was palpable, but neither spoke. They knew what was at stake as they approached the property. Emily spotted the high walls and security cameras surrounding the estate. David's paranoia was on full display, but it wasn't enough to deter her. She parked a safe distance away, and they observed the property through binoculars. "There," James said, pointing toward a luxury car parked in the driveway. "That's his." Emily's chest tightened. David was inside, likely plotting his next move. She snapped a photo of the car and the estate, sending it directly to Burke. Within moments, Burke replied, "Team en route, stay put." Emily lowered her phone, her pulse quickening. "They're coming," James nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "We wait. No heroics, Emily. Minutes felt like hours as they remained hidden, the tension mounting with every passing second. Finally, unmarked SUVs rolled up to the estate, federal agents pouring out in a coordinated formation. They moved quickly, surrounding the property and blocking every exit. Emily held her breath as the agents breached the gates, their movements precise and efficient. Shouts erupted from inside the estate, followed by the sound of breaking glass and heavy footsteps. Emily's heart pounded, her mind racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. Then, silence. Moments later, 2 agents emerged, escorting David in handcuffs. His once pristine suit was disheveled, his face etched with rage and humiliation. Emily's breath hitched as she saw him, the man who had caused her so much pain now reduced to a shadow of his former self. David's eyes scanned the perimeter, landing on the car where Emily and James were hidden. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. His expression twisted into a sneer, but Emily met it with unwavering resolve. She had won, and he knew it. Later that evening, Emily and James sat in Burke's office, reviewing the aftermath of the operation. The evidence Emily had gathered, combined with the raid, had sealed David's fate. His accounts were frozen, his properties seized, and his associates were being questioned. The once untouchable David Anderson was finally facing justice. "You did it," Burke said, handing Emily a cup of coffee. "Your determination brought him down." Emily nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I couldn't have done it without James. And Rachel." Burke raised an eyebrow. "Rachel Cooper. We're bringing her in for questioning too. She's not exactly innocent." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I understand. She made her choices, but she helped us when it mattered." As Burke stepped out of the room, James leaned toward Emily. "How do you feel?" Emily exhaled, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. Relieved, angry, free. She glanced at James, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." James smiled. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You didn't just survive this. Emily, you won." In the days that followed, the media exploded with news of David's arrest and the downfall of his empire. Emily's name was kept out of the spotlight, a request she had made to protect her privacy. But as she watched the coverage, a sense of closure settled over her. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. Not the woman defined by betrayal, but the one who had fought back and reclaimed her life. One evening, as she stood on her balcony overlooking the city, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. "Thanks for not giving up. You're stronger than he ever was." Emily smiled faintly, her gaze shifting to the horizon. The journey had been painful and harrowing, but it had also shown her the depth of her own resilience. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, justice and truth could prevail.